Okay, so this video is just going to walk through the interpretation of the results of the isokinetic ankle assessment. There's 5 sets. The first set was just a normalization set to ensure that the resting torque and the passive tissue tension of the triceps surae complex was minimal and accounted for the gravity reduced position at the setup. So at 30 degrees, we can see that there's minimal torque up to 5.4 foot-pounds at maximum. And then when we scroll down, we can see that there's a minimal blip on both sides. So that's good. Again, this first set was really just a check of that. If we move on to the second page, so this would be our first set, and we'll just kind of keep it straight. So as far as like what we did on each test, so there was 4 additional actual active tests. The first was concentric 30 degrees. The second was eccentric 30 degrees. Then we did the same concentric eccentric at 60 degrees per second. So that's important because when you're interpreting the results, you have to know where to look. It's not the actual report doesn't give you the eccentric and concentric necessarily. So for the first active set, we're going to focus in on this first column. So again, it gives you the speed, 30 degrees per second. Our metrics of interest are going to be our peak torque to body weight. We consider the coefficient of variance to ensure that it was a valid test and that there was a minimal learning effect going on. Max rep of total work is also somewhat relevant. More importantly, I'm interested in work relative to body weight, so normalized, and then total work as well. We can also get a sense of the amount of fatigue. Granted, we didn't use a fatigue protocol. There was only 5 repetitions per set. Additionally, one metric that I have started to look at has been average power. And then because we did an interrupted concentric and an interrupted eccentric, the agonist to antagonist ratio doesn't really apply in this case. Additionally, it's noteworthy to ensure that we're relatively accurate with our range of motion sets from one exercise, from one limb to the next. We can see here that we're within a degree. So that would, if that was off for some reason, someone was stiffer on one ankle versus the next, that would potentially be a confounding variable as to their total work. So the first thing that we look at beyond the metrics mentioned is going to be the normality of their strength curve. So for the plantar flexors, the normality of the strength curve looks like kind of a playground slide. So you should have a steep onset of peak force deep into the dorsiflexion range of motion, and then a gradual decrease as the individual approaches more and more of a plantar flexion position. And this point right here kind of represents that 0 degrees of the position where they cross over from a neutral ankle to a plantar flexed ankle. Interpretation of the results that we see before us. So foot-pounds, we can see that the peak torque that the individual was able to be within 5%, which is great. For a healthy male, these would be really good values. Anywhere between 55 and 65% of body weight would be normal for concentric strength at 30 degrees per second. Moving on to the second page of the active results. So then we have 30 degrees per second. However, right, this was the eccentric, so it's going to be labeled as dorsiflexion, but we know what we did, and keeping that straight is going to be important. So our eyes are going to move to these 2 columns of the right and the left, respectively, for the uninvolved and involved. Eccentrically, there's a slightly larger discrepancy between the limbs at 10%, but our peak metric, or our key metrics, or key functional indicators are going to be the same. So we look at our coefficient of variance. I will say that people typically aren't used to working against resistance eccentrically, particularly throughout their entire range of motion. So you may see that there is more of a learning effect here that will play out in the coefficient of variance. Anything over 15% would be considered in question. But as we get into faster speeds and smaller joints, that also there can be more variance there as well. Once again, we'll look at total work. It seems that total work is playing out as a meaningful discriminatory variable that can show the discrepancies between the limbs as far as functional performance here. Anything over 10% we start to take notice of, so 18% difference. But otherwise, the work to fatigue ratio and the average power, I would actually say that the average power also shows to have some meaningful discrepancy at 20%. So it should be an inverted slide at this time point with the eccentric. Once again, this is going to be at their max plantar flex position. They move through the range of motion, getting deeper and deeper into dorsal, and then they would eventually peak at the end range of their plantar flexion. Or, excuse me, at the end range of the dorsiflexion range of motion. So that would be normal. The other thing that is not shown that is noteworthy as well is considering someone's concentric to eccentric strength. So for the plantar flexors, that should be anywhere between 1.3 to 1.5. Some references have recommended up to 2, but I think that's a bit excessive. I don't typically see that in the clinical practice. So keeping in mind 214 and 192, so as compared to 141 and 133, so that is approximately 1.5 times. So that looks really good. Moving on to our last 2 sets. So we have 60 degrees per second. Once again, we're back to the concentric, and we can see that once again the individual is within 10%. So there's no glaring deficits there. Really impressed with the plantar flexion to peak torque. Concentrically to body weight here. Sometimes with the faster speed, people will drop off in their peak torque. We didn't see that here, which is great. Coefficient of variance still within our bandwidth of acceptance. Total work to body weight, once again we see the total work showing to have a greater meaningful discrepancy between the limbs rather than just the peak torque alone. And then yeah, really a beautiful plantar flexion strength curve. Even better than what we saw with the slower speed at 30 degrees per second. And then comparable, the average power shows to be within about 20% limb symmetry. So overall, there's a consistent favoring of the dominant limb and the uninvolved limb of the right, regardless of the speed, the type of contraction, or the metric that we're looking at. And then finally, we'll look at the same interpretation for the 4th set. Once again, we're looking eccentrically here, so we look over at the dorsiflexion column, or what is labeled that, even though it's we know that it to be the eccentric plantar flexion. Again, within 4%. The things that stand out to me here is the consistency of the total work and the average power being different across and consistently across all of the types of muscle contractions: concentric, eccentric, 30 degrees, 60 degrees. So that may be something that would be targeted within rehab to try and pull them within 90%. But overall, the strength curves are normal. The peak torque to body weight, even on the unaffected side, or even on the affected side, looks to be pretty good. And concentric to eccentric strength ratios are also within normal limits and acceptable. So that's how we go through the interpretation of the test. The results are a little bit different than some of the other test reports, especially when we do the interrupted stroke assessment. The other thing that you can notice that I highlighted but didn't actually describe was that we used a torque positional graph here rather than oftentimes it's a torque to time curve. All right, thanks so much.